The night my world fell apart. Hey guys, I'm Dante, and this is a story I've been meaning to tell for a while now. It's about the night my wife confessed everything, and how it all went completely sideways. So we were having dinner, just the two of us, when Daisy confessed she'd been cheating. But this wasn't just any affair, no way. She did it in the front seat of a car with a guy she said she couldn't resist while I was working overtime at the fire station saving lives. She made it sound like a little slip-up, something we could just brush under the rug, but to me it was like the world around me just crumbled. I was about to tell her I wanted a divorce, but then the story took a wild turn. She said it wasn't consensual, that he'd forced her, that he'd been stalking her for weeks and finally attacked her. She called it a nightmare she couldn't escape. But something just felt off, like she was trying to rewrite the truth. Let's rewind a bit. I was living the dream, right? At 34 I was a firefighter, a paramedic, part of a special ops team. Loved my job. It was stressful for sure, but I always made it home to Daisy and our little girl, Molly. Molly was just 2.5, walking like a little champ. Seeing her toddle around, her little face full of mischief, always cracked me and Daisy up. And there's nothing sweeter than listening to her blabber on, so proud of her new baby teeth, like it was the most amazing thing in the world. Evenings were always special. Daisy, she's the most patient, loving mom, teaching Molly new words. I'd clown around and make them laugh. Our little house was filled with laughter, and all the stress of my job melted away when I walked through the door. We didn't need much, just each other. Then, one night, right in the middle of dinner, my phone rang. That urgent, heart-stopping sound from the station. Major fire, high-rise in the city center, the dispatcher's voice crackled. I looked at Daisy and Molly one last time, swallowed, and stood up. No time to hesitate, I grabbed my gear, the gear I was so proud to wear, said goodbye with a smile, even though my gut was twisting with worry. I'll be home soon, I told them, just like always, and I was gone. The scene was chaos. Flames were engulfing the upper floors of the building, black smoke billowing up, blocking out the night sky. Fire truck sirens wailed, blending with screams and shouts as people frantically evacuated. My team was rushing around, adrenaline pumping, knowing every second counted. I heard the report as I arrived. A gas valve malfunctioned in the building's power grid, leading to a huge explosion. Some people had escaped, but others were trapped on the upper floors, trapped with the flames that were consuming every precious moment. Chief Silas, this grizzled veteran, 53 years old and seen it all, stood at the front, calm but firm. He pointed at the burning building, assigning me and Mark, another guy my age, to the left side to search for survivors. Other crews were quickly deployed, everyone had their mission. But we all knew this fire was spreading faster than anyone anticipated. We didn't have much time. Without a second thought, Mark and I charged into the building. Flames roared right in front of us, the heat so intense it felt like it could melt everything. There were cracking noises, glass shattering, the ominous sound of metal warping, all of it hammering at my mind. But there was no time for fear or hesitation. Every step had to be calculated, careful, no room for error. Mark and I pushed deeper into the building, hoping to find someone alive. We had a strict time limit. Stay too long, and the whole building would collapse, turning into a fiery inferno that no one could escape. The pressure was on, but I knew I had to stay calm. Each second was a fine line between life and death. Mark and I raced through narrow hallways, thick black smoke obscuring our vision, the heat from the flames unrelenting. Sweat poured down my body under my gear, but I barely noticed. The roar of the fire was deafening, but then, a faint sound cut through it, a cry for help. Someone in there. I yelled through my mask, straining to hear. Mark nodded, and we moved toward the sound. On the left side of the stairwell, a man huddled on the ground, coughing violently, his hand covering his face to shield him from the smoke. I'm here, he croaked, his voice rasping from smoke inhalation. We're getting you out, breathe slow, Mark said, his voice resolute. I pulled a damp cloth from my bag, wrapped it around the man's mouth and nose. Here, put this on, it'll help you, I said, handing it to him. The man shook his head, but gratitude was visible in his eyes as he started to breathe more slowly. Mark grabbed his arm, pulling him up. I'm getting you out. Hold on to me. I'll stay, I told Mark, my eyes scanning the area, see if anyone else is trapped. Get him out, quick. Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Be careful, Dante. Don't take any unnecessary risks. Don't worry, I won't make you come back for me. I chuckled into my mask, even though the situation was incredibly tense. Mark and the man turned and charged toward the fire escape. I watched them until their figures disappeared into the smoke, then turned back, continuing to survey the area. The tension was escalating. The fire roared like a hungry beast closing in, and my time was running out. I knew this building wouldn't hold out much longer. Just as I was about to make my way toward the fire escape, I heard a tiny, barely audible whimper amidst the smoke, faint, almost swallowed by the flames. My heart pounded, and I rushed toward the sound. It was a hallway filled with fire, the flames blocking most of the passage. The floor beneath my feet was starting to sag, the cracking sounds a warning that it could collapse at any moment, but I didn't hesitate, took a deep breath, gritted my teeth, and plunged into the inferno. Through the thick smoke, I saw a sight that made my stomach drop. A little boy, maybe 7 years old, his face streaked with tears, holding onto his mother's hand. A massive beam had fallen on her, pinning her to the floor, struggling to get free but unable to. Her eyes were filled with agony and desperation. "Help my son, please," she gasped, her voice choked by smoke. I rushed over and bent down, trying to lift the beam, but it was too heavy. I strained every muscle, pushing until sweat mixed with smoke on my face, but it wouldn't budge. The mother looked at me, her eyes understanding what this meant. She knew there could only be one survivor. "Please," she wheezed, her eyes pleading. "Take my son, I beg you." I hesitated, my chest feeling like it was being squeezed. How could I leave a mother behind? But just then, a loud rumble came from outside, signaling the building's imminent collapse. I had no choice. "There's no time," I thought, a sense of guilt rising within me. I shook my head, cursing myself, and quickly pulled out my damp cloth, wrapped it around the boy's mouth, and held him. "Breathe deep, stay calm," I said, my voice catching, and lifted him. The mother, her eyes blurred with tears, kept urging me, "Go run, please." As I started to run, the boy reached out for his mother, his cries of "Mommy, Mommy," echoing through the fire. They tore at my heart, but I had to go. I had to save the boy. The flames roared behind me, threatening to consume everything, but I couldn't turn back. I just held onto the boy tightly, raced towards the fire escape, the mother's frantic pleas and the intermittent cries of "Mommy" echoing in my mind, a haunting memory. Finally, I saw the light of the fire escape ahead, just a few steps away. I reached the door, threw it open with all my strength, and burst out into the open air, feeling like I'd just escaped hell. The cool night air hit my face, but everything around me was still chaos: fire truck sirens, screams, urgent commands. I sank to the ground, gently setting the boy down. He was still sobbing, tears streaming down his smoke-streaked face, his eyes desperately searching for the burning building. "Mommy, where's Mommy?" he asked, his voice breaking. I couldn't answer. I just held his shoulders tight, my heart heavy. Just then Chief Silas rushed over. He looked at me with concern, asking, "Anyone else in there?" I tried to stand, but my body felt like it had no strength left. Covered in soot and sweat, I shook my head weakly. There was a mother. She was trapped. I couldn't get to her. The words caught in my throat. The guilt was crushing, like all the air around me was being sucked away by the flames. The mother's desperate plea to save her son, the boy's calls of "Mommy," still echoed in my mind, gnawing at any remaining composure I had left. Silas put a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of sympathy, but it couldn't erase the haunting memories. "You did all you could," he said, but his words didn't lessen the gnawing self-recrimination in my mind. The boy was still crying, trying to break free from me to rush toward the burning building. "Mommy, where's Mommy?" he yelled, his tiny hand outstretched, but I held him tight to stop him. Looking into his tear-soaked eyes, I knew this image would haunt me forever. The fire raged on behind me, and I knew that of all the people I'd saved, some wounds would never heal. The boy's cry of "Mommy" would stay with me forever. I stood there, my eyes fixed on the building engulfed in flames, the black smoke billowing up to the sky like a stark reminder of what was left inside. The fire burned fiercely, refusing to relent, even as my team tirelessly sprayed water from the hoses. Powerful jets of water, but they seemed like futile attacks, like a grasshopper against an elephant. So next to me, the boy continued to cry, tears streaming down his smudged face. His cries were like a razor blade cutting into my heart. They say children who understand things too early always bear the most pain. I looked at him, and in that moment, I knew he understood. Even though he kept calling for his mother, I saw in his eyes that he knew, no matter how many times he called, his mother wouldn't come back to him. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and full of despair, and whispered something I'll never forget. "My Mommy, she's dead, right?" My heart constricted, simple words, but carrying such weight. I couldn't lie to him, but I couldn't answer honestly either. So my throat tightened, unable to speak. I just looked at him with a heart full of sorrow. I couldn't answer, and that silence, for him, was the answer. Chief Silas couldn't hold back either. He turned away, tears welling up behind his protective goggles. Even after a long career seeing tragic events, this was too much to bear. I heard a few choked sobs from some of the female firefighters as they approached. One of them, Emily, gently knelt beside the boy, wrapping her arms around him. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice soothing but laced with pain. She patted his back, trying to calm him, while tears streamed down her own face. I stood there, my hand clenched tight until the knuckles turned white. I couldn't do anything but watch. Deep down, I knew I was sinking into the same sadness as the boy. The nagging guilt over the mother I couldn't save seemed to cling to me, refusing to let go. My team understood. They took turns coming to me, placing a hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of comfort. I didn't need to say anything. They knew how I was falling apart. But even so, none of us could change the heartbreaking truth of this night. The boy's mother wouldn't come back, and this fire would forever be an unhealed wound. The rain finally came, but it was too late. Heavy drops poured down from the sky, like a tearful heaven mourning for what was lost. The rain washed over the raging flames, carrying away the remnants. When everything was safe, the rescue team went back into the building. I didn't go with them. There was nothing more I could do. The building was now just a charred heap, a scene of utter devastation. Pieces of the ceiling and concrete walls lay scattered, the remnants of a ferocious fire that had consumed everything. Rescue workers carefully stepped over the rubble, searching for any signs of life. Medical teams were there, tending to the injured who had miraculously escaped. But then, the agonizing truth began to emerge. In a corner of the collapsed building, they found the mother's body, the boy's mother. She hadn't survived. The beam had made rescue impossible. Even after the fire was extinguished, her life had been extinguished forever. Outside, the boy was now sitting in an ambulance. Doctors were trying to calm him, to help him regain some composure after everything he'd seen. My team stood nearby, their eyes heavy with sadness. They knew the devastating truth had been confirmed, but none of them had the courage to tell the boy. How could we shatter his already broken heart again? Instead, everyone silently held a memorial service right there, heads bowed in reverence for the mother who had sacrificed herself to protect her child. The rain continued to fall, blending with the tears of those present, while the boy sat in the ambulance, oblivious to the fact that his mother was gone forever. Small candles were lit, white flowers placed next to where they found her. We stood in silence, unable to speak. The sorrow of that night would forever be etched into our hearts, especially mine. The mother's last look, the boy's desperate cries of "Mommy," still resonated in my mind, a memory I might never forget. In that moment, amidst the persistent rain and the deathly silence, I realized that in this job we don't always win. Sometimes we have to accept losses, no matter how painful they are. So as the scene was cleaned up and the investigation concluded, I couldn't shake the heavy feeling in my chest. The building was extinguished, but in me the fire of guilt still burned. I looked at the boy, now alone in the world. He sat on the bench in the ambulance, his eyes red-rimmed from crying, but no more sobs came. A terrifying silence enveloped him. I wondered where would he go now. He had no one left. A sense of guilt seeped into every thought. I felt responsible for both of them. The mother had begged me to save her son, and I did. But the thought of leaving her behind haunted me. I couldn't leave this boy alone again. Ron, I learned his name from my team, had no one. As we were preparing to leave the scene, I walked over to Chief Silas. He looked at me, his eyes full of empathy, but also weariness. I took a deep breath and told him what I had been thinking about for hours. "Chief, I want to adopt Ron. The boy has no one and I can't leave him." Silas looked at me for a long moment. I could see the hesitation in his experienced eyes, but then, after a pause, he simply nodded. He didn't try to stop me. "You've thought this through?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "I have, Chief," I replied, my voice steady. "He has no one else. His father left long ago, it was just him and his mother. I feel like I owe them. I want to take care of him, the least I can do right now." Silas sighed but didn't object. "I understand. This won't be easy, but if you've decided, I support you." He put a hand on my shoulder, his eyes showing trust, but also sorrow for what had happened. Ron, the boy, had been through so much in a single day. I later learned that yesterday was his birthday. The devastating fire had taken his mother on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. But instead of cake and candles, Ron got the flames of a tragedy and a loss that couldn't be filled. Every time I think about it, it breaks my heart. How could a child like him endure such immense pain? I didn't know if I was capable of making up for it, but I knew I had to try. I looked at Ron, sitting silently, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if he couldn't believe what had happened. I walked over, sat next to him, and softly said, "Ron, from now on I'll take care of you. You don't have to worry anymore, okay?" He looked at me, his big, innocent eyes full of confusion. But then he slowly nodded. His whole world had changed overnight, but at least I could give him a place to belong. I knew this journey wouldn't be easy, but looking into his eyes, I told myself I had to try. It was the only way I could atone for what I felt I'd done wrong, and give Ron a sliver of hope amidst the pain. The rain was still falling lightly as I drove Ron home. He didn't say much during the drive, just sat quietly beside me, his eyes vacant and weary. Ron probably understood what had happened. He knew his mother was gone, but he didn't say it. He seemed to have entrusted his fate to me. No resistance, no blame. How could he blame me? I did all I could, and Ron knew it. When we arrived at the front door, I felt the weight of sadness on both of us. The door swung open, and Daisy stood there waiting for me. Her eyes widened with surprise when she saw me with a little boy. Both Ron and I were covered in mud and ash, our faces heavy with unspoken grief. Daisy didn't ask anything right away. She just watched, her eyes darting between me and Ron, understanding that something serious had happened. I could see her lips starting to form questions, but then, seeing the sadness in both of our faces, she stopped. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting us into the house. I led Ron into the living room, but I realized he was too exhausted and hurt. I decided to bring him to my room, where there was a warm bed that I figured he needed most at this moment. As I helped Ron into bed, he remained silent, his eyes hazy away, but he wasn't crying anymore. He probably cried all his tears already. "Get some rest, Ron," I said softly, sitting down next to him. "I'm here, don't worry." He nodded slightly, his eyes starting to close as exhaustion took over. But I knew this sleep wouldn't be peaceful. I sat beside him, waited until he was truly asleep before leaving, my heart still heavy. His eyes, his silence, the unspoken things, they all played in my mind like a haunting melody. When I stepped out, Daisy was waiting at the door. She looked at me, her eyes filled with concern and understanding. "What happened, Dante?" she asked softly, her voice gentle, but laced with empathy. I sighed, leaning against the wall, wearily looking at her. "The fire today, Ron lost his mom in it. He has no one else, so I decided to adopt him." Daisy was silent for a moment, her eyes reflecting sadness. She came closer and placed her hand on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't imagine what he's going through right now, and you don't need to explain any more. I understand." We stood there, no words needed. Daisy always understood me best, and in that moment, I knew she felt the pain and haunting memories that I carried within me. She didn't judge, didn't question my decision, she simply empathized. That whole night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Ron and his mother, gone forever, plagued my thoughts. Daisy sat beside me in bed, her hand gently resting on mine, offering silent comfort. Our lives would be different from this point on, and I knew that not just me, but Daisy would share this responsibility. But at least I had tried to do the right thing, and that was the only thing that could ease my inner turmoil. The next morning, Daisy and I were in the kitchen, making breakfast. Daisy stood by the stove, cooking quietly while I arranged plates and bowls on the table. The house was quiet. The morning sunlight gently streamed in through the window, bringing a peaceful atmosphere, but a quiet ache remained in my heart. Suddenly I heard a soft footstep from the hallway. Ron appeared in the living room doorway, looking hesitant and awkward. He stood there, looking around, uncertain what to do. His eyes seemed to be inspecting this new environment, careful not to cause any trouble. Just then Molly, our little girl, woke up. As soon as she saw Ron, her eyes lit up. She beamed and ran around him, her tiny legs scurrying, laughing and pulling at his shirt, babbling in Fati. Molly's innocent gesture seemed to disarm Ron. A small smile seemed to flicker across his lips, though it disappeared quickly. But in that moment, the awkwardness of Ron seemed to melt away a little, and he felt the warmth of this house. Seeing Ron wake up and stand there, I smiled softly and called out, "Good morning, Ron. Come on, sit down, let's eat." Ron nodded gently, walked slowly toward the table, still a little reserved. He didn't say much, just sat down quietly. Daisy handed him a bowl and chopsticks, but I noticed he was still hesitant, unsure how to start. I gently put some food in his bowl, a small smile on my lips. "Just eat, no need to be shy." Ron didn't speak, but he nodded slightly, thanking me quietly and starting to eat slowly. Throughout breakfast, he remained silent, not chatting, probably still adjusting to his new environment. Most of the time, I helped Ron eat, trying to make sure he didn't feel abandoned or lost. When the meal was over, I stood up, looking at Daisy. "I have a few things I need to take care of," I said, my eyes glancing over at Ron, my heart heavy. "Stay home, okay?" Daisy just nodded, and Ron remained seated, his eyes looking down at the table. I walked out of the house, taking a deep breath, trying to gather my composure before going to a place I knew would be incredibly difficult, Ron's mother's funeral. When I arrived at the funeral, the sky was still slightly overcast, as if everything around me was also sharing in the loss. A somber atmosphere enveloped the place. The small family gathered quietly to say goodbye to the unfortunate woman. I stood there, looking at the coffin, my heart heavy. The guilt came rushing back, taking over my mind. I had saved Ron, but I hadn't been able to save his mother. Her pleas for help still echoed in my head, making me feel like I had failed. As I looked at the coffin, I bowed my head, weighed down by thoughts. I couldn't save her, I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. But then, I reminded myself I had to do the best I could with what was left. I would take care of Ron, give him a home, a new family. It was the only way I could compensate for this pain, for what was lost. I stood there for a while longer, silent in the face of Ron's family's loss and sorrow. As the other mourners started to leave, I turned and walked away quietly, telling myself I would take care of Ron with everything I had. He had lost so much already, and I wouldn't let him lose anything else. Time passed, day by day. Initially, Ron was still quite distant. He spoke little, always keeping a distance from everyone in the house. I understood. He'd just lost his mother, his world had changed in an instant. The feelings of being lost and hurt were undoubtedly still weighing heavily on his young soul. But gradually Ron began to understand his situation. He had nowhere else to go, and I, along with Daisy and Molly, were the only family he had now. I noticed small changes. He started to join us at the dinner table, nodding when I or Daisy asked him how he was doing that. He wasn't completely open, but I knew it would come with time. To help Ron adjust, I enrolled him in the nearby school. On the first day, I could see the tension and a little anxiety in his eyes as he stood at the school gate. "Just relax, Ron. I'll pick you up after school," I said softly, trying to reassure him. He just nodded slightly and walked in quietly. I stood watching until he disappeared into the crowd of students, telling myself that everything would be all right. And it really did. Day by day, I could see Ron gradually adapting. He started to attend school regularly, still spoke little, but at least he had some stability. Daisy and I tried our best to take care of Ron. I always made sure to make time to take him to school, help him with his homework, and treat him like a part of the family. What surprised me the most was that Ron was very understanding, even at his age. He never demanded anything, he even took initiative to help with chores around the house. Many times, Daisy and I would see Ron quietly cleaning the house or wiping the table after dinner. Daisy always tried to stop him. "Ron, no need, I can handle it," she would say, but Ron would just smile slightly, shake his head, and continue his task. One day, I saw Ron trying to sweep the yard outside. His movements were small but very careful. I walked over and gently placed my hand on his shoulder. "Ron, you don't need to do these things. Let me and Daisy take care of it." Ron looked up at me, his eyes bright but with a maturity beyond his years. "I want to help. I don't want to be a burden," he said, his voice small but firm. My heart sank at his words. Ron had lost his mother, and he was trying not only to adapt but to contribute to the life of this new family. "You're not a burden, Ron," I said, a gentle smile on my lips. "You're part of this family, and everything will be okay." Ron said nothing more, just lowered his head and continued sweeping, but I knew he was starting to accept this new life. After the fire, the haunting feelings and guilt didn't leave me. Memories of that night, the cries in Ron's eyes, the mother left behind, they all remained vividly in my mind, even though I tried to forget them. I decided to take an extended leave of absence to focus on Ron, and to confront the emotions that were still bottled up inside me. Ron was slowly adapting, but I knew deep down he still carried immense sadness. He spoke less than many kids his age, and when I tried to talk to him, Ron usually answered briefly, not delving into his emotions. I didn't want to force him, I wanted to let him open up in his own way. Then one day, while Ron and I were sitting together in the living room, he suddenly said something that made me freeze. Ron turned to me, his deep eyes looking straight into mine, and softly said, his voice low but full of emotion, "I know Mommy's dead, Mr. Dante. I know, you tried your best. I don't blame you." I stopped, feeling like all the air around me was sucked out. Ron's words cut deep into the pain I couldn't let go of. He understood. He knew the truth from the beginning but kept silent until now. And he didn't blame me, the thing I was always afraid of, the thing I was constantly berating myself for. "I just wish you would take me to see Mommy," Ron continued, his eyes fixed on me, as if waiting for my approval. I bit my lip, the sorrow rising in my chest like a huge wave. I nodded, unable to say more, knowing he needed this, and I did too. "Okay, Ron," I said quietly, my voice catching. "I'll take you." I drove Ron to the cemetery that afternoon. The two of us sat in the car, neither of us speaking. Silence enveloped us, but it seemed we understood each other through our shared grief. When we arrived, I led Ron to his mother's grave, a new grave with a simple headstone. The wind blew gently, the air cold and still, only the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Ron stood before the grave, his eyes quietly following the inscription on the headstone. He didn't cry, he didn't sob like I imagined he would. Instead, he just stood there, his eyes contemplative, as if he was thinking a lot. He knelt down and gently placed his hand on his mother's grave. "Mommy," Ron said softly, his voice calm but deep. "I know you're gone, and I know you did everything to protect me." I stood a short distance away, my heart clenching as I listened to the boy's words. Ron continued, his voice steady in the air. "I'll live for your life. I'll try to be a good person. You can rest easy, Mom," Ron said, his eyes still glued to the headstone. "Thank you for bringing me into the world. Thank you for loving me." I couldn't hold back anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I tried to stay composed, not to break Ron's moment. He wasn't crying, he didn't need tears to express his pain. He was beyond his years, and that made my heart ache even more. When Ron stood up, I walked over to him. "You did great, Ron," I said quietly, my voice full of emotion. "I promise you, I'll take care of you, just like your mom wanted." Ron looked at me, his eyes clear and full of determination. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, but I knew he understood. We left the cemetery together, carrying with us the memories of the mother who was gone, and I knew that from this point on, we wouldn't be alone. People say time heals all wounds, and it seemed like it was slowly becoming true for Ron. As the days passed, I could see the boy opening up more. The deep pain he carried seemed to ease, no longer the shadow that engulfed his life as it once had. Ron started to fit in naturally with our family. He helped Daisy take care of Molly, even played with her, filling the house with laughter. Molly adored Ron, always running after her new big brother. Those moments made my heart feel lighter, like Ron had found some peace in this new life too. Daisy was fond of Ron too, and she constantly expressed her gratitude for his help with chores around the house. Every time I saw Ron sitting with Molly, taking care of her like a real brother, I couldn't help but think of his mother. She would be so proud to see her son grow into such a responsible, mature young man. As for me, even though time passed, and things seemed to be settling down, the nagging guilt about that fire remained. Nights without sleep, I still wondered if I could have done something different to save Ron's mother. The guilt didn't disappear, but it was no longer a heavy burden that made me unable to continue living. Instead, I started to accept it as part of my life. And then, I realized I couldn't keep living in guilt. I needed to go back to work, back to the mission of saving lives that I had pursued for so many years. It was what I had to do, not just for myself, but for people like Ron, people I could help in the future. I decided to return to my job as a firefighter. But this time I wasn't doing it out of duty or obligation. I was doing it because I understood I needed to save more people to compensate for the harm I couldn't stop. I couldn't change the past, but I could change the future. And somehow, I believed this would be part of my own healing process. One morning, I was sitting with Ron in the living room, chatting as usual. "Mr. Dante," Ron said suddenly, his eyes full of a maturity I didn't expect from a boy his age. "I don't know how to say this, but I know you did everything you could. Mom wouldn't blame you." Ron's words, though simple, brought me peace. I smiled, putting my hand on his shoulder. "I know, Ron. And I promised your mom I would take care of you. I'll do everything to protect you." Ron nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He had found peace, and so had I. I knew it was time to go back to work, to continue my mission as a firefighter, and to save more lives. That day, I went back to the fire station, the place where I had dedicated my life. I felt ready to confront the past and move forward. Chief Silas met me at the door, his eyes filled with understanding and respect. "So ready, Dante?" he asked, his voice full of confidence. I nodded, a gentle smile spreading across my face. "Yes, Chief, I'm ready." From that moment, I knew I was back, stronger, more determined, and ready to face the challenges ahead. I'd never forget what happened, but I understood that the most important thing was to keep moving forward to save more lives, and to compensate for the wounds that couldn't be healed. Life seemed to be slowly getting back on track. Ron had settled in well at school and at home, Molly was now in daycare, and I had returned to my job at the fire station. Everything seemed to be getting calmer, but then I started noticing some strange changes in Daisy. Daisy, always so energetic and cheerful, had become strangely lethargic and silent lately. She no longer smiled as much, and sometimes seemed to be absent-minded. I initially thought it might be because she was tired from managing the house and taking care of both Ron and Molly. But these changes were becoming more apparent, and I started to sense that something was wrong. One afternoon, Daisy surprised me by bringing me lunch at the fire station. This wasn't unusual, she used to do it often, but today something felt different. When I opened the door to greet Daisy, I immediately noticed a small but undeniable detail, a cut on her wrist. It was a fresh cut, still red and slightly swollen, visible under the long-sleeved shirt she was wearing. My eyes narrowed, a feeling of apprehension rising within me. "Daisy, what happened to your wrist?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my eyes were full of suspicion. Daisy quickly pulled her hand back, pulling her sleeve to cover the wound. She gave a forced smile, her eyes flashing with worry. "It's nothing, just a little accident while chopping veggies," she said, trying to sound lighthearted. "I'm clumsy, so I cut myself." But something about her voice and demeanor made me uneasy. The cut on her wrist didn't look like an accident from cooking. It was too straight, too clean, like it was intentional. But I didn't want to cause further tension, especially since Daisy seemed reluctant to talk about it. I nodded, though my heart was still full of doubt. "Okay, we'll talk about it later," I said quietly, taking the lunchbox from her hand. Daisy gave a small smile, but it wasn't the bright, joyful smile I knew. It held something, heavy, distant. The whole afternoon I couldn't focus on my work. The image of that cut on Daisy's wrist kept replaying in my mind, and a gut feeling told me something serious was happening that I couldn't grasp. That evening, when I got home, I decided to have a serious conversation with Daisy. I couldn't let this anxiety linger without finding out what was going on. There was a nameless fear in my heart that something terrible was happening to Daisy, and I needed to find out. I walked into the house. It was the usual scene. Ron was studying in his room, Molly had been picked up from daycare and was playing in the living room. Daisy was cleaning up the kitchen, as always, but she couldn't hide the weariness in her demeanor. "Daisy, we need to talk," I said, my voice low but firm. She turned around, her eyes flashing with confusion, but she knew she couldn't avoid it. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "About the cut on your wrist," I replied, not wanting to beat around the bush. "You said it was from chopping veggies, but I don't believe it." "Daisy, I need you to be honest with me. What's going on?" Daisy was silent for a moment, her eyes looking down at the floor. I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was hiding something, and that made me even more worried. She began, but her voice was weak. I knew Daisy needed time, and I was ready to listen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to change our lives in a way I wasn't prepared for. Daisy remained silent for a long time, and I could feel the turmoil inside her. Finally, she took a deep breath, her eyes welling up with tears, but not a single one fell. The words she was about to say made the air between us thick, heavy, and suffocating. "You want the truth, right?" Daisy whispered, her voice trembling. "Okay, I'll tell you, but I don't know if you can forgive me after this." I stood still, my heart tightening. "Daisy, just tell me, I'll listen." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with pain and guilt. "I felt so lonely, Dante. I don't know how to explain it, but ever since Ron came to live with us, ever since you went back to work, I felt like I was drifting away, like you didn't care about me anymore. I know it's not true, but the feeling wouldn't leave me." I was stunned. I hadn't realized Daisy felt this way. I tried to find the right words, but Daisy continued, her voice breaking with each syllable. "One night, I couldn't stand the loneliness anymore. I didn't want to be home alone, so I went to a bar. I know it was wrong, but I just wanted to escape the feeling. And then I met this guy, he was really handsome, and I started talking to him. I felt the blood in my body freeze." Daisy's words felt like knives piercing my heart, she continued, her voice a whisper, as if afraid that by saying it, everything would shatter. He asked me out. We went to his car, and," she hesitated, tears starting to roll down her cheeks, we had sex. My heart felt like it was being squeezed. I looked at Daisy, not knowing what to say. Everything in my head was blank, only the pain and hurt surging through me. The world seemed to crumble beneath my feet. The wife I loved and trusted, who I thought I knew, had just admitted to betraying me, to seeking another man while I was trying to take care of this family. "I know it was wrong," Daisy continued, sobbing. "I can't forgive myself. I don't know why I did it. I just felt trapped, Dante." I stood there, silent. The pain spread through my entire body, as if each of her words was leaving a deep wound. I looked at Daisy, the woman I loved, who had been through so much with me, and now her betrayal felt like an impossible blow. After a long moment, I found my voice. Did you think about this family? About Ron, Molly, and me? How could you do this?" Daisy hung her head, her voice a barely audible whisper. I know I was wrong. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to hurt anyone. But I felt like I couldn't keep going. I thought about leaving this world. I felt like my chest was being crushed. It wasn't just the betrayal, but the thought that Daisy contemplated suicide, that she felt worthless. I was in pain, not just because of the betrayal, but because of the suffering she had endured alone in the darkness. After a while, I looked straight into Daisy's eyes, trying to stay composed. "Daisy, I don't know what to do anymore. Hearing you say this, I feel like I'm being torn apart from the inside. But I can't just ignore this. You betrayed me, betrayed this family." Daisy looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I know I don't deserve to be forgiven, but I hope you understand it wasn't because I stopped loving you. I just felt lost." I bit my lip, my heart torn. A part of me wanted to forgive her, to find a way to mend what was broken, but another part, the part deeply wounded, wanted to end it all, to walk away from this marriage. I might file for divorce, I said, my voice laced with bitterness. I don't know if I can get over this, Daisy. I love you, but this betrayal, it's too much for me. Daisy collapsed, sobbing, but I couldn't comfort her. I needed time, and I needed space to understand what I needed to do. My heart was filled with pain and hurt, and I wasn't sure if this marriage could be salvaged. The next morning, I left for work as usual, but my heart carried the bitterness and hurt from the previous night's conversation with Daisy. She didn't just betray me, she admitted to feeling so lonely that she didn't want to live anymore. It left me confused and worried for her, but the betrayal was still too fresh, too deep, for me to think clearly. Not long after I arrived at the fire station, I got a call saying that Daisy had attempted suicide. She'd left a note, full of despair, and it seemed she didn't want to face me anymore. I immediately asked for permission to go home, but when I got there, it was too late. Daisy had been taken to a psychiatric hospital to be evaluated after showing signs of self-harm. I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding with worry. But when I got there, they wouldn't let me see Daisy. According to the rules, she needed to be isolated from everyone to ensure her own safety and the safety of others. She needs time to stabilize, a nurse told me, and I could only wait. For the next week, it felt like I was living in a state of turmoil. I couldn't see Daisy, and the thoughts about what she had done kept swirling in my head. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind always drifted back to Daisy, to our marriage, to the things she had confessed. I didn't know if I could trust her anymore, and if I could forgive her after everything. Finally, Daisy was released from the hospital. She came back home, looking exhausted and frail. We sat down in the living room, the tension between us thick and suffocating. Daisy started to tell me a story she'd kept hidden all week. Actually, it wasn't like I told you, she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't voluntary, he raped me. I froze, feeling like the ground beneath my feet crumbled. I couldn't believe my ears. What did you say? I asked, my voice choked. Daisy looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. That night, he followed me out of the bar. He didn't ask me to go to his car. Actually, he forced me. He took me to his car and raped me. I couldn't move, I just froze, hoping it would be over quickly. A sense of pain and confusion washed over me. Daisy continued, her voice wavering. When we were in the car, he did it. After it was over, he told me to leave. I didn't know what to do, I was scared. I couldn't keep my composure any longer. My mind was exploding with a mix of questions and rage. I bit my lip, then looked straight at Daisy, trying to maintain some composure so I wouldn't yell. Why? I asked, my voice hoarse from anger and confusion. Why didn't you call me right away? Why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you report it at the bar? Why didn't you scream for help? Why didn't you press your alarm? Daisy trembled at my words, but she kept her haunted eyes fixed on mine. I don't know. I was in shock. I couldn't think straight. I just wanted it to be over as quickly as possible. I looked at her, the pain and disappointment surging through me. Shock. Daisy, if I'd gone through something like that, the first thing I would have done is call you for help, or at least call the police. You didn't do that. You didn't tell anyone. You let this burden weigh you down for all this time without doing anything to stop him. Daisy sobbed, tears streaming down her face. I know I was wrong, but I really didn't know what to do at that moment. I stood up, feeling the rage mixed with pain burning inside me. I don't know what to do, Daisy. We're both hurting, but I don't know if I can get through this. Daisy hung her head, saying nothing more. We both sank into a heavy silence. The wounds were too deep, and I didn't know if they could be healed. But one thing was certain, the trust between us had completely shattered, and nothing could change that right away. I felt like I was stuck in a chaotic whirlwind, where everything around me was spinning out of control. The feeling of being overwhelmed, confused, and hurt kept hitting me, giving me no time to breathe. I didn't know what to do, where to go from here. Daisy was facing a mental breakdown, and I couldn't find a way to confront what she'd done. I sat quietly in the living room, my thoughts swirling in a dizzying frenzy. Molly was playing outside in the yard, her innocent laughter drifted through the window, but it couldn't bring me any comfort. And Ron, the boy who had just begun to find joy again after so much pain, and now I had to confront a new pain, the betrayal from my own wife. I knew I had been wrong to neglect Daisy, to let her feel lonely in her own home. I had been too focused on my work, on my responsibility to save lives, forgetting that the person closest to me needed to be saved, too. But that couldn't change the fact that she'd betrayed me, and that was something I wasn't sure I could forgive. Every time I looked at Daisy, I felt torn. She was clearly struggling mentally. Her descent into despair was real, and what happened afterward wasn't just a betrayal, but the result of a weary, lost soul. But how could I turn a blind eye to what she'd done? How could I forget the image of that other man, who had her while I was still trying to take care of this family? I felt trapped. My head kept spinning, trying to find answers to 1,000 questions. Should I forgive Daisy and stay in this marriage, pretend like nothing happened? Or should I walk away, leave everything behind and start anew? But if I left, what would happen to Molly and Ron? Molly was too young to understand what was going on, and Ron had just healed from so much pain. If I decided to leave, would I be causing them more hurt? Daisy was still struggling with her mental state. She was so vulnerable and needed help, but I felt too exhausted to take on this responsibility. My mind kept racing, unable to find a way out. Finally, I stood up, feeling like I couldn't sit still any longer. I went to the window, looking out at the yard where Molly was playing with Ron. The kids were oblivious to our inner struggles. They were still innocent, as if everything was fine. I stood there, my heart filled with turmoil. My marriage was on the verge of collapse, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to save it. Should I keep trying, turn a blind eye to everything to keep this family together? Or should I accept that it's over, and the best thing for everyone is to start over? But no matter which path I chose, one thing was clear: no one would win in this situation. I still loved Daisy, but the pain of the betrayal was too much to ignore easily. I still wanted to protect Molly and Ron, but how could I protect them when I was drowning in chaos myself? I stood there, looking out the window, not knowing what to do next. All I knew was that my life had changed forever, and I couldn't go back to the peaceful days of before.